this life is too damn short to be making somebody else money. So, everybody has something they can do. And if you can identify any aspect of that, and, of course it changes all the time. There were so many different aspects of things I wanted to do, and I'm super scattered in that way, but just finding something, that your kid's interested in and being like, hey, yeah, you should probably try and do that because, I know we're all afraid of the idea that, it won't work out and you'll be a starving artist or whatever these things are. But, that's sort of, disingenuous to the many, many people that actually do make it doing this stuff. So I think anything is really viable as long as they have a desire for it and a drive for it. Just, push them to keep at it and work hard for what they want to achieve.
I'm Srini Rao, and this is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, where you get a window into the stories and insights of the most innovative and creative minds who've started movements, built thriving businesses, written best-selling books, and created insanely interesting art. For more, check out our 500-episode archive at unmistakablecreative.com.
Doing creative work can be kind of lonely, and that's why we built the Unmistakable Listener Tribe. The tribe is a community for professionals to connect and support each other. Everything is designed to help you grow your business and share what's working and what isn't. And that's true whether you're a business owner or an artist. You'll get access to feedback, live conversations with guests, and so much more. By joining the tribe, you become part of a community of creators who all support each other, and it's completely free. Hopefully I'll see you there. Visit unmistakablecreative.com/tribe to join. Again, that's unmistakablecreative.com/tribe. Ella, welcome to the Unmistakable Creative. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you so much for having me. Stoked to be here.
It is my pleasure to have you here. So I found out about your work because you wrote in and you told me that when anything is not to your own specifications, you make it yourself. And when I saw the line, I'd even create my own underwear. I thought, okay, this is somebody I have to talk to. Anybody who creates their own underwear is certainly unmistakable. But before we get into all of that, I want to start asking you, where were you born and raised, and what impact did that end up having on the choices that you've made throughout your life and your career and where you've ended up today?
So I was born in Malibu, California. My mother was one of those wacky hippies that just had a kid by herself in her bathroom one night with no doctor, no nurse, no midwife. And then she decided that it was a good idea to swim her baby in the ocean because we lived right on the beach at the time in my grandfather's house there. And she would take me out and swim me in the ocean because apparently babies don't need to learn how to swim. They already swim. So I never learned how to swim because I never forgot how to swim. So she just would throw the baby in the water and you just swim like little fish or something. So anyway, that's where I was born. And then I ended up moving through various means up to the mountains and lived in the mountains of Fraser Park. So about an hour and a half or so outside LA, going up north at the top of the Grapevine. And, sort of lived in mountains and trees with goats and chickens and horses and all the animal type things that you can imagine. And yeah, my mom and my stepdad when I was 5, and he's a super creative person and just one of inspired as well, who, wants to make something, wants to sort of encourage you to do something creative yourself. And that was a really great, I think, base for me because I can be kind of scattered. So having somebody that was like, oh, let's go and paint this today, or let's go and do this today, or wow, that looks so good, was definitely really encouraging for my creative process during that time frame. And my sister was always, my older sister is unbelievably creative as well. And being, a few years older and also arguably much more talented at these things was always sort of that benchmark of where I was always trying to, basically through my stepdad's encouragement and all of that, I just kept going at it, even though I knew she was better than me at things. And it sort of just increased my drive to want to be better at stuff. And especially being able to see somebody that, at least in my mind, was way better at what I wanted to do than I was. It was just sort of this okay, you can see someone doing that and you just have to work really hard till you can get there. And that was sort of the baseline for all of my desire to create things, was watching somebody that I was like, you're way better than me. And I could totally get there if I work really hard. And that desire to work really hard just had always sort of been there, and wanting to make things better than they are. But now I live up in the Bay Area next to the ocean again. So my creativity is definitely spurred on by large bodies of water as well.
One thing I wonder about is, you mentioned being raised by hippie parents, and that is pretty much the exact opposite of being raised by Indian parents. And so I wonder, what were the narratives that you were raised with about making your way in the world?
My mom can pretty much do anything, or she certainly has done an awful lot and was very on the DIY side of things growing up. She made her own teepee. She sewed her own teepee. She had teepee poles, and she walked up to someone's just house in random Washington and knocked on the door and was like, "Hey, can I set up my teepee and live in your backyard?" And they were like, "Yeah, it's fine." She lived there and milked cows and just did every interesting thing that she wanted to do. She was super into horses, and so she works with horses. She's a farrier, so she puts shoes on horses and trims their feet and all that good stuff. But for a while there, she had her own business where she made these little flower things that like clip into your hair, and she traveled all over the place, and she had employees, and then she's also a pilot, and so she flew places in her airplane. And she's just one of those people that has a lot of ideas and has really taken and rolled with a lot of them in her life to make, a lot of different sort of directions of her vision come true at different points in her life, which is really inspiring to me because she just would sort of pivot whenever something wasn't working. And I think that's such an important aspect of, being creative and building your own sort of life is, you have to identify when things aren't working and then just shift to something else. So, she's the kind of person where when all my crazy ideas that I came up with would sort of show up, she'd just be like, "Yeah, you should do that. It's a great idea." Like I went to college in Scotland, knowing absolutely no one, to study a degree that nobody cares about, just totally unemployable. And she was like, "That's great." And then in my last year in college, when I was getting ready to come back and I was trying to figure out what I was going to do to, continue being creative and still make my bills get paid. And I came across this, video about these old tiny houses, and you build them on trailers and then you can pull them around with a vehicle and move them all over the place. And I was like, "Yep, that ought to do it. If I can't afford to pay a lot of bills, I'll just make the bills smaller." And so I called her up and I was like, "Hey, I know I've never built anything before, but I want to move home and I want to build this little tiny house in your driveway, move up to the Bay Area and just be a starving musician." And she was like, "Yeah, cool. That sounds great. You should do that." So she's just been this person that's always sort of just like, encouraging to a T for every somewhat ridiculous idea that I have. And it's definitely molded me as a person to feel much more capable of doing things, if only to know that there's somebody behind me that doesn't think I'm a total wacko.
One of the there are two questions that come from this. One is what advice would you give to parents who are listening to this, just based on sort of this, endless encouragement that you got from your mother? Because I think there are two sides to this coin. Sometimes I think parents can be encouraging to a fault and, encourage unrealistic ambitions in their kids, which often lead to disappointment. But then there's the flip side of that, where they don't encourage anything at all and pretty much discourage any crazy idea. So based on your sort of upbringing, what would you say to parents who are listening to this?
Man, that's such a tricky one, because I feel like so much of this is dependent on, whatever sort of nature you have built into this person. And it's sort of a malleable thing. And, you don't necessarily know how your encouragement is going to be taken. Because I definitely think if I were set up with a different sort of baseline, just like whatever makes me up as a person, and somebody were that encouraging, then it could have like backfired. So I wish that, if it seems like there should be an easy way to be like, yeah, just be like encouraging as all hell. But, I think there's definitely some balance in there, because, she's the most like complimentary, encouraging person ever. And like, it's super annoying for me because I'm just like, whatever, mom. But, if I were a different person, my head could be huge. I could be a total dick these days. I'm like, yeah, my mom thinks I'm amazing and I'm super amazing. But I really don't know. I mean, I think it's best to just like, I was really, really passionate about these things, and I worked really hard at them. And I think the sort of like distinction and the difference is that like, or something that you should pay most attention to. And this is something that my mom has always said. And someone gave her this advice when she was, having troubles with my sister and I when we were younger. And, they just said, well, find out what she really cares about and, push her to do that and make her really for it. Like help her get what she wants, but make her work for it. And I think she just sort of took that idea and just rolled with it. And, I was always really, creating all kinds of things and doing stuff and coming up with all these ideas. And, I think she just sort of kept encouraging us to keep doing, what we liked. And she's very unconventional. And I think what I really liked about her encouragement was I was a very nervous child. I felt like I had to, I don't know, become a dentist or like marry a millionaire or something if my life was going to work, even though I knew that I loved all this creative stuff. Like even as a kid, my sort of fears were that like, I almost knew that it was unlikely for those things to actually work for me. And so having the encouragement was super important. So I think if I personally didn't have an encouraging parent, I don't know if I would have had the balls to actually, make this stuff happen on my own. Cause I was like, okay, I'm going to live at home forever. I'm not going to go to college. For some reason, I always felt like dentistry was going to be my like go back to job, which is funny because I can't imagine it's a very easy thing to do at all. And I have zero interest in it whatsoever. But I was like, well, if everything else fails and I lose my art, I'll just become a dentist. It's very practical, very strange practical child. But having my mom's encouragement and having, the encouragement of my stepdad as well, just sort of solidified to me that I could just keep doing this stuff. And even if it was just, my way of pulling myself out of my hard days and, my little funks and depressions, then it was worth doing anyway. So eventually it just kind of kept going and I kept coming up with new ideas and they kept saying, yeah, you should probably try that. And then, that really built me up as a person. So I mean, take it with a grain of salt is what I'd say. But I mean, I think encouragement, if it's something important, if it's like, you probably shouldn't, I don't know if it was great for mom to be like, you're the most talented person in the world. She really dumped the praise on, but, encouraging someone to work at what they like and to pursue something that, is maybe unconventional, but really makes them happy, using your creative brain to take something that's, generally speaking, not really that profitable, but using your creativity to make it into something that works in some way is one of the things that just gets my brain going and really fuels me to keep going. So, using your creative, what you want to do and try and find a way to make it work for you, because this life is too damn short to be making somebody else money. So, everybody has something they can do. And if you can identify any aspect of that. And, of course it changes all the time. There were so many different aspects of things I wanted to do. And I'm super scattered in that way, but just finding something, that your kid's interested in and being like, hey, yeah, you should probably try and do that because, I know we're all afraid of the idea that, it won't work out and you'll be a starving artist or whatever these things are. But, that's sort of, disingenuous to the many, many people that actually do make it doing this stuff. So I think anything is really viable as long as they have a desire for it and a drive for it. Just, push them to keep at it and work hard for what they want to achieve.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a follow-up to that is, we had a guest here and he was describing some, friend of his who had been raised by parents who were, super sort of enlightened, self-actualized, had a lot of self-improvement in their life. And, her trauma was that basically her parents were too perfect. What are the things that you thought were a pain in the ass about the way your mother raised?
Well, my mom was real late. I say was in the past tense as though it's something that's magically fixed itself, but it totally hasn't. Like hours late for shit. Like, not that there's anything wrong with that, it builds you as a person, but like just so late you can barely imagine it. And like we had our harp lessons every week on Fridays at like 6 or whenever we had them. And like, we just couldn't really be any later to these things. And luckily my harp teacher just kind of rolled with it. But like that was probably one of the more difficult things. And also like she was so positive that it was like super annoying sometimes because she'd just be like, be like, oh, we're hours late and everything's fine. It's like, what? I don't think so. Of course, if it was something that she was late for, it was a little slightly different story. But, something we're late for, it's like, oh, it all works out. And I'm just sitting there like imploding in the back seat. Like, what the? I'm like, I don't think it's fine. But, what's interesting is that like, so both of my grandparents, my mom and my dad actually grew up next to each other. Their dads were both like, the sort of exception to the rule, successful musicians that were, made it enough that they lived on the beach in Malibu next to each other. And mostly by coincidence, but pretty cool because there's not that many other, full-time musicians in different aspects that make their way to being next door neighbors, especially, in the 40s in Malibu on this sort of random beach stretch. But they both had totally made it. Like my grandpa was my dad's dad was a composer, arranger, conductor, and he worked with Frank Sinatra and Louis Armstrong and Nat King Cole and Judy Garland and stuff. So he had his, shit all together. And then my mom's dad was like a band leader. He played the saxophone and he was a studio musician. He was in and out of all, Fox Orchestra, and he had a band at Disneyland. And so what's interesting is that both of my parents, in their own creative ways, also were so in the shadow of their parents that neither of them, despite being quite musical in their own right, never actually did anything with music. And so I think that my mom's sort of almost perceived like suppression that she had as a person to not really pursue music, because not only, was her dad so musical, but her older sisters were super musical. And she, you get picked on third girl, and the two older ones sort of band together. And I think she just sort of, just kind of turned against that side of her. And my dad describes, it's so funny. I think he continued to play piano until he was like, I don't know, like 9 or 11 or something like that. And he described himself as being just good enough to be wretched. And it's like, when you have these people looking over you and you feel like this is, something that you aren't going to be able to achieve, then I think it really impacts that. And, they're both, true stories of people that took off with what, they found important and just rolled with it. My dad is a sports writer, and he's never had a business card because he's never needed one. He's worked for the San Francisco Chronicle for like 30 something years. He's just, totally stuck with what he wanted to do. And obviously my mom's all in her horse stuff. And my stepdad works in the Hollywood industry, movie industry, moving trees around because he's an arborist and he likes trees and it's the cutest thing ever. But, they all sort of did their own thing. But I think having, my mom having been in a situation where somebody that was in her family, she felt like it was something she couldn't really achieve for whatever reason. She was really like, you guys are playing music, you're doing all the creative things, you can do whatever you want. And I think not necessarily that her parents didn't say those kinds of things to her, but for whatever reason, the impact was just that like, this is, I can't make it to that level. So I'm just going to find my own thing and do that. So I didn't really get that from my parents because my mom was just so, delightfully all over the place. But yeah, I think there's definitely the fear of like, having this thing. And I never met my grandparents, and like, obviously I always wanted to, but like, in a way I'm like, maybe that wouldn't have been so good, because then I would have had that same fear, they always just kind of got to be in my head as like invisible support for, my endeavors, I guess. But
this episode of The Unmistakable Creative is brought to you by ThoughtWorks, a global technology consultancy that's hiring senior and lead developers, data engineers, infrastructure consultants, and more to join them in their roles across the United States. It's pretty clear that last year changed our working lives forever, and maybe it made you realize that you were ready for a change. At ThoughtWorks, they challenge curious minds to make a real impact, get to know them, and discover how you can make your mark in tech. At ThoughtWorks, you're free to seek the most ambitious challenges, free to change career paths, free to use technology as a tool for social change, and free to be yourself. They're looking for change makers, opportunity creators, status quo shakers, thought workers. And if you're listening to The Unmistakable Creative, that's probably you. Learn more and apply at thoughtworks.com/careers. Again, that's thoughtworks.com/careers.
Yeah. So one thing that I get the sense of just from listening to the way that you describe your mother is that she was this incredibly resourceful person. And the reason that just, struck me was because I just recently wrote a blog post about the value of resourcefulness. And there's this movie called The Gods Must Be Crazy. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
Oh my God. My mother we watched that movie incessantly. Like I could hum you the music. I could tell you the lines. That is so funny. I have never heard anyone else reference that film. That's so funny.
Well, I mean, the reason I brought that up is you obviously, like this, tribe of Kalahari Bushmen take something that most of us would consider just absolute garbage, a Coke bottle, and find all these different uses for it. I wonder, what is it that enables a person to build that kind of resourcefulness into their life? Because even venture capitalists will say say that one of the things they notice in founders when they get a round of funding is that once they have an abundance of resources, they become less resourceful than they were in the past because they don't have to be anymore. And I've seen that pattern in myself as well. And I wonder, what did your mom teach you about being resourceful, and how do people build that in themselves?
Yes. And I was listening to some TED Talk, however, and it made such an impact because it was somebody, and I'm totally butchering this probably. I'm sure the person is not listening, but if they are, I'm sorry, but I'm summarizing your TED Talk terribly. But they were it was someone in education, and they were effectively talking about, like what made people successful, like what made children, in whatever they pursued, like what was it that made those people more successful, in the sort of general ways that we accept as success. And basically they were sort of trying to identify what it was, and what they labeled this thing was grit. And what I thought was just so fascinating is that if anything, basically talent and grit are not connected. If anything, they're almost inversely related, in the sense that, the people that have more grit in a lot of the percentages actually have very little talent, and people that have tons and tons of talent don't necessarily have the grit, and if anything are almost less likely in some ways to have grit than people that have less talent than that anyway. And one of the things that I've always sort of held as really valuable in my life, as something that's very dear to me, is that I was sort of aware that, at least in the sort of creative arts, maybe slightly more so in music than my sister, but at least in the creative arts, I really didn't have talent in that regard. I wanted to do it. And, all kids are creative, and you make a thing, you draw a stick figure and you're like, yeah, that's you. And this is me, the kids do that. But, especially as you get older, you sort of, you lose that, especially when, you sort of realize that you weren't that good at it and that other people are better than you. And then you just kind of bounce out. But I just didn't really care that everybody was better than me. I didn't really care that I wasn't good at it, because I just had this idea that like I could do it. I could make something happen. It was the focus and the dedication that was going to get me through it. And even if I didn't, I started sewing when I started trying to sew. My sister sewed like a dress that was like an actual, you can tell this is a dress when she was 7. And I tried forever. And like finally when I was like 19 in college, after trying so many times, and I'd make something and I'd just, bugger my way through the whole thing and it would be horrible. And I would see a mistake and I was like, I'm going to just keep going and pretend this mistake never happened. And it's like, well, that's not a good idea. And then, the dress is garbage on the other side. And finally, when I was 19, I was like, you know what? You this time are going to learn from your mistakes, and you are going to start sewing a dress. And this time, if you mess up, you're going to stop, and then you're going to go back, you're going to fix it, and then you're going to keep going. And you're not like, I was like, this time I'm going to make darn dress. I'm going to continue working on this thing until it looks like a dress. And so there. And it took me like a pretty long time. And it's not the greatest dress in the world, but it was like, finally, just because I have never been able to succeed at this before, just because everything I've made has been a total disaster. And the one thing I made that was halfway decent, but it was brown, which is like a terrible color. I made like a poo skirt, and then I washed it and it shrank, and it was like, this is now my mini poo skirt. And it was so depressing. But like, even after all of that, it was just like, yeah, well, just because that didn't work, it's probably because of my process. It's probably not because, it's probably because I just didn't listen to the thing that was like, oh, you messed that up, you should probably go back. And that sort of like grit is something that I'm really grateful to have, because it just means that, failures are not as big of a deal, because you just sort of roll with it. And it's like, if it's something that's important to me, I'm just going to keep trying again, and like everything that I make now has taken me so much time, and I've worked so hard at it. And I really didn't have any, I don't think, sort of natural direction any more than the average child has towards creativity. But, whatever that thing is just kind of kept me going. And I really don't know how you put that into people. I don't know if it's something that you have or you don't. I know that you can always work at anything, but something in someone's mindset, if someone doesn't think they can, then that kind of kills it anyway. So, and obviously you can shift that and change it to, a more positive and sort of resourceful kind of mindset. But I don't know exactly I don't really know what makes people keep going at those kinds of things. And honestly, like my sister's an unbelievably creative person. she's really picking up her grit now and starting to do stuff with it. But there was a really long time there where, she just kind of was so creative and she could just like shit out this perfect creativity every moment of every day. And she just didn't. And, or she would and be like, oh, I only painted this. And I'm like, what the hell? It's like, it's the prettiest thing ever. But, I definitely think it's something, I think it's helpful to know this kind of stuff. Like, I think it's helpful to know as a kid that like, you don't have to be good at something. Like, you don't have to be good at anything at all. Like, you can like something, you can make something your job, honestly, and you can be not naturally talented in it. Like, it's not really about how good you are at something. It's how hard you're going to work for it. And some people don't really have the desire to do that, and some people do. But I've always, sort of wondered, like, what is this mixed bag of grit? Is it like when you're, going out of the world, it's like, oh, you just evenly disperse it or like throw some this way. And like, but I know that like knowing that that's a thing and knowing that your own perseverance and dedication can get you so much further is something that's really useful to talk about, because it's really, like something that I always think about is like, it's just you and yourself, like your entire life. Obviously you go through all these different stages of things and, new things come your way and pass by and all that. But like, it's you and your creativity and your mind and your brain, yourself for your entire life. And like, somehow thinking about things like that, it's just like, oh, like, what do I want to do? Or like, how could I keep working on this thing? Like, the time goes away anyway. So you might as well be spending it on something that you're going to get something out of, and even if it's just the self, forwarding of just being like, okay, I'm going to keep working at this thing that I super suck at.
So, you've alluded to your sister multiple times throughout this conversation, and I had to ask you, when you brought her up the first time, you mentioned that she was naturally good at all these things that you were not good at, and that she was actually better than you. And what I wonder is how you prevent that from becoming an inferiority. How do you prevent that from becoming an inferiority complex and using it as a source of motivation? Because I think it could have easily become an inferiority complex for people. I mean, there are moments in my life where I'm like, oh, my sister is far smarter than I am. And I still think that, like, even to my parents, I'm like, she's smarter than all of us. She's smarter than you guys. Like, if you're in a room with my sister, she's the smartest person in the room.
Yeah. And my sister is way smarter than me. But I think, I don't know, I'm sort of undeterred in a lot of ways. And it doesn't mean that, like, I think for me, a lot of it also is that in my sort of downtime, like in my, I mean, just saying it out there, I don't know if this is true for everybody, but like, there has to be just so much of a greater percentage of mental health issues with creative people because, first of all, everybody tells you that it's not going to work. And second of all, just the sort of mindset, I think that allows the creativity also allows a lot of the, sort of filters that I think a lot of people keep in place to, keep from going insane by how horrible the world can be is just like, you're seeing more of that, I think, as a creative, and you're taking more of that in. There's more of like the sort of burden of everything because, at least from what I can tell anyway, and people that I know that are creative as well, is it's like that those filters are just, they let some things in sometimes where it's like, wow, I shouldn't have let that in. Like, now I'm going to freak out about this thing for however long or cry about these people that, I know aren't getting what they need, and it's like, it's hard to have that kind of openness in your mind to let in all of this stuff that's super scary. And just in general, like, I think, the mental health aspect for musicians, creatives, artists, that whole sort of vocation is just so prevalent. And for me, whenever I got stuck, in those places, like even as a kid, like the way that my body trained me to get out of those was to make things and was to create something. And there's basically two things I know that will get me out of something. And it's some form of creativity or cleaning. And I fucking hate cleaning. So it's going to be, it's not going to be that, we'll put it that way. So I'll turn to, creativity and trying to make things happen in that regard. And I don't know if it's necessarily, I've never really talked to my sister about that to find out if she pulls herself out of things with that or not. But I think that sort of set the stage because, when I get depressed about stuff, when I get bummed out about stuff, creativity, and even though I'm sort of under the shadow of something that is probably, better in some way, I'm still pushed, I'm still driven to do that thing. So it's almost less of like, I think of, people are like, oh, I'm driving this creativity or something. And it's like, but when you're really being driven by something, there's less of a choice to it. It's just sort of like a coping mechanism or like an automatic reaction that just kind of shows up when you're in this situation. It's like, oh, okay, we're faulting out. Time to make something. So I don't know. There's something in that definitely always kind of keeps me going. And, what's good is that, she was never like, you can't draw. And if she had been, that would have been a lot worse. Like, she wasn't telling me I couldn't do things. She was just very casually proving to me how much better she was at everything. But she wasn't trying to do it in like a super competitive way. She would just make something to be great. And then I tried to make something and it wasn't very good. And my stepdad would be like, Ellie, that's amazing. And I was like, okay, well, someone thinks it's good. And, I think it was just sort of like, she wasn't being a jerk about it. And my other sources were supportive enough that I just kind of kept going in it. But I definitely think that there's the potential for some real loss of creativity to happen there because, especially as children, when you're, everything that everyone's saying holds more weight in a lot of ways, and you hold on to those things a lot. Yeah. So I really didn't get squished, even though she was better than me. No one squished me. And like, I don't know if that's replicable in other people's lives, but like not being squished and the continuous drive to make things out of my personal misery, I think sort of kept that from being something that stopped my progression.
Yeah. Well, we have to talk about music because, I know that you play the harp, and the only thing I ever remember about people who play the harp, I remember one of my friends, because I was a band geek, I played the tuba, and one of my really good friends in, ninth grade was a cellist, and he said, there's only one thing about harp players in the orchestra. It's always the most beautiful woman in the orchestra who plays the harp. Like, that's literally the stereotype is, and when I saw your pictures, I was just like, yeah, that seems to be validated here. So what made you choose the harp of all the instruments you could have chosen? Because that's such a that's almost as obscure as the tuba, but far more useful and a far more pleasant sounding instrument than a tuba.
Oh my God, that's so funny. Yeah, all credit for music goes to my mom. Like she just, she didn't do music because her dad did music and her sisters were better at piano than she was, and they sang better than she did. And so when it came around to us, she was like, yeah, you're playing music. It was almost like, sort of the opposite of like, well, you're taking music lessons. There wasn't, and not that we weren't interested in it, but she was just like, you're playing music. So, I think when my older sister was like 2, she had all these little like music for little people, like magazines or something, or, various little things that she'd somewhere in all the, I don't know, hippie stores or something. And she ended up buying this little harp, and it was like absolute garbage. And it was tiny, and it's like basically like a cigar box with strings. And we did nothing with it for ages. I think we were really, really little when she got it. And, the only thing the harp did for us was like, we put a string on it and like tied it to our backs and banged it into walls and pretended we were the harp and Jack and the Beanstalk. And like, we didn't do anything with the thing, but it looked pretty. And so we'd sort of wail away on it. And then, she asked everyone in the family, because we had a lot of musicians, like, oh, do you know anyone that plays the harp or any harp teachers or anything? And nobody really had any ideas of what to do with it. And then one day, when I was in school, one of the brief times that I was in regular school, and one of the absolute nanoseconds in time where my mother was actually at the school that I was at, like doing something like, I don't know, volunteering or whatever you do. And one of the homeschool kids on the mountain had come in, and she was playing harp in the auditorium. And my mother like ran over to her mother and was like, who is your teacher? And she drove me and my sister 100 miles to our harp lesson and back. So 200 miles basically every Friday for like 8 years before my sister could drive. And we started, we moved out and did our own thing and kept taking lessons on our own. But she was really dedicated to the idea of us playing something. And I think she just thought it was pretty or something. So thankfully she did. And, there was a point when I was like, I want to quit. This is lame because, learning is hard and practicing is annoying. And my teacher was very Australian.
I can relate.
and really wanted me to, to play like classical music. And I was like, eh. So I was like, I'm going to quit. And I like pitched this whole thing to my mother, and she was like, that's funny because no, you're not. And I was like, what the hell? And then I was like, well, guess I can't quit. And then that was, that's it. So kept doing it forever.
How old were you when you wanted to quit?
I started playing when I was 8. My sister started playing first. And I should note, because this has always been a sticking point, that I did steal the harp from her. She played the harp first, and then I was listening to everything that she played. And then when I came in, I was basically, like a week behind her or something, even though I was 6 months later. And she's always been a little bugged by that. But anyway, I did steal the harp from her. Sorry, Anna.
But I mean, so you decided to quit. Your mom doesn't let you, but clearly, I mean, this is a huge part of your life from what I gather. I mean, your website is ellaharp.com. So
it is, yeah.
I wonder, what is it that made you love it enough to see it this far?
Well, I think like when I wanted to quit, what I didn't like was the music that I was playing. And what I wasn't so sold on in that moment was like the style of teaching that was being presented to me. And, when I was like, I want to quit. And she was like, no. I think I was probably 11 or probably like 10 or 11. I'd probably been out for a couple of years. And it wasn't really fun anymore. And so I was like, yeah, I want to quit. She was like, no. And I'm, first of all, so glad that she said no, because, when she didn't just listen to the little tyrannical me being like, I'm over this. And my 11-year-old brain has totally thought out all the pros and cons. And, I obviously kept going. But I think for me, what made it work was I was able to recognize, I was like, well, it's not that I don't like the instrument. It's that I don't like the music that I'm playing. I don't necessarily align with the teaching style that's happening right now. So it was pretty shortly after then that I started writing my own little tiny tunes, like little bits of things. And I found out that if I wrote my own music, then my mother would be so proud. And when we showed up to the harp lesson, she'd be like, oh, Carolyn, you have to notate what my daughter wrote. And Carolyn would be like begrudgingly writing down all these ridiculous little notes in my silly little, 5-note tune or something. So I basically assigned writing music to like getting out of really having a lesson. And I was like, well, this is cool. And then I just kept at it because it made more sense to kind of like go that route. And then as I realized that what I was writing was sort of more along the kind of, Celtic, I guess you could blanket statement say it as, or like sort of more traditional kind of music or whatever. So that got me more interested in sort of like Scottish and Irish music and all that kind of stuff. And then I ended up going to this music academy in Scotland where I studied traditional Scottish harp music and the Scottish Gaelic language. And it was the only thing I was really kind of that made sense, because I felt like I kind of, not like I had to go to college, but, that was kind of the thing that you're supposed to do if you want to move forward and what have you. But in the States, you have to learn classical music or jazz, at least at the time. I haven't done much research into it since, but like that was pretty much it. It was classical or jazz. And I was not interested in either of those. So when I found this like program in Scotland that was like, oh, you just, take folklore as like an elective. And like, we don't care that you can't do math. And I was like, well, that's fantastic. I'm going. And the sort of music that I was playing was always really the most impactful thing to keep me interested in the instrument. And then after college, the traditional music has always been a big kind of part of the core of what I loved about it. But like, it sort of stopped ticking the boxes for me. And then, that's kind of when I started leaning more into my own songwriting. And that's when I started, like writing actual, songs that I was singing and having the harp accompany things. I've brought it back up to the forefront. So it's basically just like really lucky, I guess, kind of like re-envisioning of the instrument whenever it started to kind of fizzle out, except for that one time when my mom was like, no, yeah, you're still playing the harp.
What if finding your own voice helped heal a nation?
Look at how, in many ways, African Americans have been at the forefront of moments where the country changed for the better.
Hear a conversation with Smithsonian Secretary Lonnie Bunch on the latest episode of That Made All the Difference, a Bank of America podcast. He discusses his work showcasing the moments that tell the story of all Americans. Find That Made All the Difference wherever you get your podcasts. What would you like the power to do?
So one thing we've talked a lot about at Unmistakable Creative is how environment influences our behavior. And if you're like me, you might walk into some of those fancy department stores or see someone's Pinterest board and be filled with envy and think, I could never make my place look like that. Well, with Redecor, you can finally take control and unleash your creativity to design a space that you love. Before you start painting your bedroom or bathroom or living room some sort of color because you think it might look cool, you can actually test it out with Redecor. And without having to spend a fortune or buying tools and accidentally knocking down the walls in your home when you're just trying to hang a picture frame, you can actually test things out. Redecor is the perfect fusion between home design and mobile gaming, and with this interactive redecorating game, you become the designer. It's your style, your rules, and it sharpens your decorating skills, helps you to relax, and it unleashes your creativity. So why not download Redecor while you're listening to the podcast? It's completely free and available on both the Apple App Store and Google Play. Download Redecor now and become an interior designer today, even if it's just for fun.
It's funny. I think you're really fortunate because unlike the harp, the tuba is one of those things you can't really, do a whole hell of a lot with. So I quit. After 9 years, I was like, you know what? There's not a whole lot I can accomplish with this. And I remember my friends like, you want to guarantee you're not going to get laid in prom night? Serenade a woman with a tuba.
Oh my God. I think that's what my little sister played for like a hot minute there. And I think my dad described it as like farting elephants or something. It's so funny.
Pretty much. Yeah, no, that's pretty much absolutely true. So one thing, I wonder about your sort of college experience going to Scotland. And when you go and live in a different culture for that long, and you come back to the United States, so they talk about two things. And I know this from having studied abroad in Brazil, you have sort of reverse culture shock. But I wonder, what you observed in differences in terms of sort of how people are socialized there and sort of the value systems that people have when it comes to their lives in a country like Scotland versus the United States.
Absolutely. Yeah. My culture shock was sort of amplified in a handful of ways. Leading up to everything, I had a bizarre sort of like education beforehand. So I went to school up to third grade, and then in fourth grade, I didn't really like my teacher that much. I ended up going through second grade twice, not just because my friends, I was always in mixed classes, and then I was going to go into third grade, and my friends group was in the younger class. So I just ended up doing second grade again. So I was always a little bit older than everybody, sort of like going through regular school. And then I was homeschooled in quotes for a couple of years, but I don't know that I really did anything. And then in sixth grade, again, I went back to school. So sixth grade was like my jam. Like I was in public school and I was a person and I was like a little bit older than everybody, but it just made it so that I didn't really get picked on or anything. And then at that point, my sister, who was 14, was not challenged at all in what she was doing. And my mom was a little concerned what directions she might go with her intelligence while not also being challenged with other things. And so somebody was like, oh, you should take her to the community college because she can take college classes. And, if she's really smart, then that might be interesting for her. And so my mom was like, yeah, it's a great idea. So she started taking my sister to the community college. At this point, I'd graduated. I don't think you graduate sixth grade. I'd finished sixth grade. And she was like, well, you can go to seventh grade or you can come with your sister and I to the college. I don't really care what you do, but if you go to seventh grade, you might never see us again. And I was like, okay. And so I was like, well, I guess I'll go to college. So I actually started community college when I was 12, right out of sixth grade. And I never went to high school. I had like an online high school that was like supposed to be, you do all the, work and it's all scheduled out, but you can technically do it in however much time you want. So basically we were through that high school just so that, the college would allow us to take these courses. And through that, you could take 12 credits, 12 units a semester. And so, which wasn't that many classes. So I take maybe like 2 or 3 classes, like a semester or something, like a music class or, whatever else that was interesting, like, improv or theater or something like that, or English or history or, whatever seemed interesting, but certainly never math. And then, I do like 11 weeks worth of work and like a couple of days at the end of the semester with the online thing and like somehow get an A- and then like move on to the next semester. But from then I ended up being like, I was 12 and people, and especially in community college, you have, all ages there. So you have people, like my mom that were in their like 40s and 50s and people up into their 60s. And then, I'm just this like, like awkward little 12-year-old that's just bouncing around, like wearing all the worst possible, I think, this is a good idea to wear when I'm 12 kind of stuff. So like I wore Crocs. It was really embarrassing. Although it was like the first Crocs ever. My mom like brought them home from some random like horse thing she went to and was like, look at these shoes. And 12-year-old me was like, that's amazing. Those are mine now. And then that didn't last very long. But anyway, that's an aside. But yeah, so I ended up graduating from community college when I was 17, just because I'd been there so long that they were like, yeah, you can go now. You just have to test into some math class or something. And so I ended up like testing this math class, which is hilarious because like I took it, you had to take it like every semester. And so I kept taking it. Finally, like I got out of like the basic one, and then you could just take business math. And somehow, because I had enough credits, because I'd been there since I was 12, they actually like let me graduate, which was like super cool. But anyway, so my previous experience was basically American college. And even though I was a lot younger than everyone, and even though it was community college and I wasn't taking that many classes, and it wasn't like the pressure of the world wasn't really on me so much because I had all the time in the world effectively. But of course, it was still like everything that you get right now is on your record forever. So you have to keep that. But when I went to Scotland, the whole school has 800 people, and there were 17 people in my year on my course. So I basically went, and over there, it's like, it's small enough that you're not picking classes. You have like one elective a year or something like that. But I basically went from what felt like American college to Scottish high school. So it was like this kind of weird thing of like not going backwards, because obviously the education was quite challenging and super fascinating. And I love that aspect of it. But socially, it was kind of odd because I was already pretty weird by California standards. And I showed up like, hello, I'm California weird. And it was like, okay, well, you're with 17 other people, 16 other people. I think it was 17 overall. Anyway, and it's like, here are these other people, and you're studying traditional Scottish music. And most of these people are from Scotland. There were a few people from America, but it was definitely like, sort of just throwing myself into this really small world where it was pretty clear pretty early on that I was like, oh, wow, I'm not really that much like these people. So it was definitely hard to fit in and everything. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting about the sort of culture over there in general is that they don't really have as much, and maybe it's just, that my mom was so heightened on this side of the spectrum. Maybe it's not as common over here either, but like, there's this concept of like the American dream, and like, you can make anything happen, or you can like, everybody makes it all the time. And they don't really have that in Scotland. And, people, obviously I was in a music academy, so people were studying music and, doing what they loved and what they wanted to do. But there was something about it that was just like, it seemed less like the, gung ho, you can do anything. It's the Wild West, make your way through Dodge. It was just kind of like, I don't know, it was more educational based for some reason. And it seemed less like motivational, like you can make it happen. It was just almost more like yep, I play music and this is what I'm doing, or I do this and that's what I'm doing. But I don't know, it might've just been where I was at the time frame. But I think that was one of the things that struck me as interesting. Not that they aren't positive people, but it was just interesting that there's less of that, like, surprising to hear. There's a lot less of the American dream in Scotland.
Yeah. I think the other thing that's fascinating to me is, and I've noticed this with a handful of musicians, as I've alluded to, the tuba is pretty much useless unless you're going to play in an orchestra. Then, you're literally waiting for somebody to die for a job to open up. My dad talked me out of doing, being a music major. Like, to this day, I don't regret that, because I've talked to friends that were an all-state band with me who did it, and they're like, yeah, it's not, your dad was pretty spot on. It's a pretty rough life. But, the thing that I think your career in a lot of ways reminds me of somebody like Lindsey Stirling, because you take, something that looks, a certain form, and, sort of playing in an orchestra is what we typically expect of a harp.
Sure.
And to the best of my knowledge, I don't know how many harp parts are written into, symphonies and stuff like that. I know assholes write, one measure into symphonies with tuba parts, because I had to play a piece. It was a Dvorak symphony in the Berklee Orchestra when I was a student there. It had one whole note in the entire thing. And it's like 45 minutes. I'm just sitting in the back to play a whole note. I was like, is anybody even notice that I'm here? I was like, why did he even write this into the piece? Did somebody who played the tuba sleep with his wife or something? This must have just been vengeance. But I think the thing that strikes me as fascinating is you sort of look at this traditional way of doing things and you reinvent it. And, I wonder, why more people don't do that. Because I mean, anybody who goes to a Juilliard or Curtis type place, we just had this guy here who was actually, an alumni of Curtis. In fact, we're probably going to air yours and his interview together in the same week because it makes sense to me now. But and he was saying like the same thing. He looked at Lindsey Sterling as an example of somebody who kind of looked at sort of the traditional model of, going around the world, doing auditions, praying for a job in an orchestra and ending up God knows where. And instead, she has built this just massive platform, and more people hear her music than they ever would have if she had been sort of the traditional, go through an orchestra, try to get you to the point where you're first violin. And you seem to have done the same. What, why is that? Like, what is it that enables people to do that? And why don't more people do that? Like, if you were to talk, for example, to a group of students at Juilliard today, what would you tell them?
Oh, man. So I think my sort of way of coming out of my shell anyway was just kind of starting to, write my own music and see where it took me. Like, so I also play the banjo, not very well at all. Sadly, hilariously, and crazily, I've almost played it for 10 years now, but I'm garbage at it. I play like 5 chords. I basically know nothing. But I write my own music on the thing. And the way I look at it is that if you write your own music, then even if you're, technically wrong, no one can really tell you that you are wrong because it's your music and it's just an instrument and it's just what you make that comes out of it that is what you have. So, I think there's a lot of I think the perception is there that like, oh, if you play this instrument, like you have to play it this way, or you have to do this, or you have to do that. And I think it's extra hard when it's instruments like, like the violin or like the harp, or like, I don't know, maybe there's a really cool thing to do with tubas. Who knows? Maybe its day is coming. Maybe it has more than one whole note in its future. But anyway, there's all this, sort of weight on these instruments. It's like, well, this is what this instrument does, and that's just what's up. And it's like, yeah, but no, because all of these things are instruments that, they make music, and that's what people have done with them. But there's so many things you can do with it. There's so many ways to make music. There's so many creative places you can put these instruments and other genres of music that make it so much more interesting to play. And not that there's anything wrong, of course, with, sort of sticking with the general way of doing it. But like, I just think it's sad that this expectation that these things just have to stay in this space. And I think it can be hard, even as a creative person, to find, you're sort of feel comfortable taking it out of that. Like, I always feel like, I don't know, that a bunch of harpists are going to show up with like cabbages and pitchforks and like throw them at me or something and shout with like torches or something at my gigs because they're going to be like, what are you doing? And that doesn't happen. But like, it's funny how much my brain still sort of expects that to like be the case. But really, there's so many things you can do with it. Like, there's so many things you can do with any of this stuff. Like, I'm just waiting for somebody to like take a harp and like put it through an effects pedal and like do like a seriously heavy metal, like screamo thrasher band or something. And like, there's pretty much most instruments can adapt to so many different like musical spaces. And I just love to see people get there. So my advice is to just start developing, your own style and start figuring out what you do that's interesting. Because if all you're trying to do is follow what's laid out, you're not going to find it. But if you sort of dig yourself and you figure out what your influences are and you just kind of start writing something, like you can come up with some pretty cool stuff, and, if you keep at it, then eventually you will, figure out what you want to do and where that sort of fits in there. And then it gets a lot more comfortable because you just sort of have a way of defining what you're doing. And then, when you just keep doing it, it gets less and less awkward all the while. And there's less and less of the, the back of your brain that's like, oh, the tuba gods are going to smite me tonight. And then, just kind of keep at it.
Yeah. I think that describes my sort of approach to podcasts in a nutshell. Like I don't, listen to podcasts at all, which is really weird for somebody who's made a living doing this. And I don't actually take course. I've only ever taken one course, and I made sure it wasn't from somebody who was an online marketer. I was like, it was from an NPR storyteller because I wanted to understand how he tells stories. But beyond that, I try not to let, sort of, because it's like you said, if you follow in somebody else's footsteps, the only place you're going to end up is where they did.
Right. And that's already been done before. So yeah. Finding your own voice is hard, but it's so worth it. Like, whatever that thing is. And like, I remember talking to someone not that long ago. I think they played violin or something. And I was talking about my sort of experience with things. And, you know, when I was out of college, I was pretty burnt out on harp. I was pretty burnt out on music in general, to be honest, because, you know, I spent so much time with it being this like really kind of heavy thing, you know, and it didn't really feel like it was expressing or it was representing me. And, you know, kind of finding my own way out of that was writing my own music and figuring out that I could still have music and myself present in it. And it didn't have to, you know, live in this little tiny box or something. But I remember speaking to someone who played the violin and they were like, man, like, I wish that I felt like I could have played my own music or like played in a rock band or like played, you know, bluegrass music or something. Cause it's like, you know, I think so much of why these instruments are abandoned in a lot of cases is just because it's like, there's just so much weight of playing like, you know, super old dead guys music all the time. And, you know, like organized orchestras and like waiting for this one person to croak so you can like have the one seat for like, you know, 3 weeks before you have a mental breakdown. It's really, you know, it's a narrow sort of calling, I guess, but it's definitely right for some people. But if it isn't right for you, friggin' find your own way of doing things, because there's so many more things that you can do with it. And you have the, you know, sort of wow factor, which is always going to be helpful. So,
yeah. So, you know, I want to finish with two sort of final areas. You know, I mean, I think the thing that really struck me about your story was this sort of DIY spirit. You know, like I said, when you wrote the words, I make my own underwear in your pitch, I was just like, yep, okay, that's definitely somebody I want to talk to, because that is just beyond weird. I mean, so one, how do people sort of develop that DIY spirit within themselves? Because I think, you know, when COVID started, there was this sense of sort of, oh, we can learn how to do anything. And I had all these brilliant ideas for all this furniture I was going to make and all these things I'd planned to do. And now I'm looking around my apartment, you know, pretty much, you know, on the tail end of a pandemic thinking, shit, I really didn't do half the stuff I thought I was going to do. But, you know, like that sort of, you know, DIY spirit to go and, you know, make a tiny house, sew your own underwear, like all these kinds of things. Like, where does that come from? I mean, other than your mother?
Other than my mother. Yeah. For me, I think it stems from a few things. So one is that I am unbelievably cheap. And that is one of the core ways that my lifestyle works. So sort of my way of going into all this was like, you either make more money to afford more, or you make your bills smaller, you make your overhead smaller, and then you make it work with less. And that's sort of my motto for everything, is just making everything work with less. And when you live like that, I like to think of me as like, you know, like being the richest poor person like out there or something. Cause it's like, you know, you're just sort of moving everything else around to sort of match whatever's coming in or not in that particular time frame. And I hate shopping. I really do. And you have to go to these goddamn stores and there's pink tax and everything always costs more. I'm so over it. Like, I'm just so over it. And I am unbelievably picky about form and function. Like, if something doesn't fit just right, it drives me batshit. And I am sitting there and I'm looking at it and I'm thinking about it and I'm redesigning it before I even knew how to make anything. I was always like, why does this suck? And how can I make it better? And, you know, for many years, I couldn't make anything better. I could make a lot of things worse, but like, slowly, as I kept going with things, I started just kind of being like, well, you know, maybe I should try to do this, or maybe I should try to do that. And when I first started kind of sewing again, you know, a lot of, I think my problem was that I was like, oh, I'm going to start sewing again. I'm going to make this grand dress, or I'm going to make this thing or whatever. And that's always sort of what I tried to do. I was trying to make these things that are, to be honest, really impractical. And you're probably not going to wear that wonky dress very often. And you're probably not going to, you know, the things that you really aren't finding that practical in your day-to-day life. So when I got back into it, I was like, underwear is expensive. I am cheap. I hate shopping. This is made out of lace. Lace is like 10 cents a yard. Why am I spending $10 on this? And also, why am I not making this myself? So I bought a bunch of stretch lace. And I was like, this time I'm just going to start making really practical things. So like a shirt that I will literally wear every day, like underwear, bras, like everything that, you know, everything I basically don't want to have to go out of my house forever. Things that are really hard to make fit that you don't want to go out for. So, there was obviously kind of a lot of experimentation in there, but they're really not that complicated. And honest to God, when you can make a pair of underwear for like, I don't know how many cents, but like cents, in 8 minutes, like who would rather do laundry or go shopping when you can make a pair of underwear for basically free in like 8 minutes? Like you've pretty much won the game of life at that point.
You're making me think I need to make my own boxer shorts just hearing that, because boxer shorts are ridiculously expensive too. It's like, wait a minute, these are $15 for 3 pairs? Seriously?
Dude, you can totally do that. And it's super like, it's maybe not the thing you tell people like first off the bat, but like it's just those cool things you can walk around being like, hey, I made my underwear. You don't say it, but you can think it. And like, as you get better at it, like, I mean, I can't imagine like having anybody's anything. Like, I can't imagine wearing, that sounds really weird. I can't imagine wearing someone else's underwear, but that is effectively what it feels like, because it's like, if I didn't make it, then like, what's the point? And, there's the like affordability thing. There's the practicality thing. There's the not leaving your house thing. There's a lot of like kind of phobias behind everything, but it's so damn practical. Like, if you need something, you just make it, so it's like, and I told myself as soon as I started to get a little bit better at it, I was like, if this is something that I can feasibly make, I am going to make it. So if something is accessible, affordable, and the quality that I'm looking for, I have no need to make it. So I do not make shoes. I don't make boots because I can find good boots made in America. I don't make jeans because I can find good jeans made in America that are, on eBay or whatever, that are still accessible to me. I tried making socks. I tried sewing socks. And you know what? I was like, socks are okay. I can just buy socks on the internet. I'm okay with that. But, I try everything out as much as I can. And then eventually my brain's like, you can buy that. So it's chill. But like, if I want a leather jacket, I sew a leather jacket. And I learned how to make a leather jacket for the first time as I'm making the leather jacket or a coat or anything I have really. It's like, if I can make this, I'm not allowed to buy it. So that stretches to anything I would use. If I need a bag, if I need a shopping bag, if I need a nice bag, if I need a dress for a wedding, if I need whatever I need, I am, designing and making, and I can't use patterns because my brain doesn't work that way. So I pretty much just cut shit till it fits, which is how I built my house, incidentally. And it's funny because everyone's always like, oh, if you want to, do all these creative things, you need to have all this stuff super nicely laid out and you need to be really organized. And I think that's one of the things that kept me from being creative for a super long time, because they're like, oh yeah, you have to be super organized and you have to measure everything and you have to do all this stuff. And I'm like, I know it's less efficient, but what if I just cut it till it fits? And everyone would be like, no, that's not the right way to do it. But it's like, it totally works for me. And so like, just the idea of winging it and the idea of knowing that like, I just don't buy something if I can make it. So it's like, if it's cold and it's winter and I don't have a coat, then I'm just going to like wear some extra sweaters until I actually get the time to start sewing the coat. But it's cool because it makes you like I'm redesigning everything like to a fault. It's actually super, super annoying because I've started noticing my brain going this way with cars recently. And I'll catch myself when I'm like, I have a great car. I have an 87 Suzuki Samurai. It's like a little box. It's like my favorite thing in the world. His name's Sam. He's a good boy. But like, he has 2 doors and he's a tin can. But if you want to get something that's 4 doors, suddenly everything is like this colossus and you can't park it anymore. And I'm like, why are these so big just to have 2 more doors? Like, it doesn't seem like you need to have this much more space. But I'll literally catch myself when I'm driving down the road and I'm like, dude, you this is not the point in your life where you can design a car. Like you're not going to make a car. You have to stop. But like, I take this into all kinds of different things. Like I play the harp, right? Harps are massive. And that pissed me off because I want to be able to travel with this thing. And like, that was sort of the biggest impact for me. And so I was like, well, I'll buy a small harp. I look for small harps, nothing that I was looking for. And so I was like, well, I'll just make one then. And so I made it out of cardboard and cutouts and like piecing things together and like some vague idea of how I thought it would work. And then my ex at the time, who's still one of my best friends, is a metal fabricator. And I was like, yo, what if we use the fact that aluminum is super light and super strong to build like a super tiny harp that I can like put in the overhead bin of an airplane and take with me anywhere? And he was like, that's ridiculous. And I was like, cool. And then slowly but surely I convinced him to make one. And like, it's the coolest thing because it literally sounds like a harp and it's super small and it fits in the overhead bin of an airplane. And I was like, cool, this is great. My creativity is at its pinnacle. I've got this. This is amazing. But then I also play the banjo and I used to travel. I started playing banjo so I could travel because you couldn't take the harp. And now I could take the harp, but then I can't take the banjo anymore. And I'm like, well, this is bullshit. So I start imagining like a banjo that's small enough to fit inside my harp case. Because if I could make the harp from huge down to that size, the banjo scale going smaller is not really that much of a difference. So like I looked online and I bought like the crappiest one I could find. And then I found everything wrong with it and started redesigning it. And then I started making up the perfect concept of this like tiny banjo. And then I built that with like a baseball bat billet and like industrial aluminum piping for like the part that's like basically just finding like the cheapest, easiest ways while something would still sound good and like make it. And so, and now I'm like conceptualizing cars and it's like super annoying because I don't know where it'll stop. But the cool thing is that like you can pretty like, I have told my brain that whatever it can come up with, if I have, any ability to do it, any resources to do it, like if there's a will, there's a way sort of thing. And like the money that I spend or that I save, I should say, not buying like bullshit bras and underwear, like is suddenly turned into this like super exciting project. And then, you get to make something that actually like works for the purposes. And that is like the pinnacle of like my existence. It's like when I make, like, I would love to have everything in my life be a 10 at like my harp is a 10, my underwear is a 10. My clothes are, pretty much at a 10, but the idea is to have everything be just the way that I want it. And that's a really, if you're trying to buy everything, it takes a lot of time. Everything takes a lot of time. But if you can take that and, internalize it and think about it and come up with a cheaper, cooler way or what have you of doing it, that's even better. If you're plagued with that sort of like constant redesigning, then suddenly you can just turn everything that you have into a 10. And that's like the most exciting concept and the most exciting thing that I could do. So I guess it sort of started with sewing and has sort of morphed itself into all these other things. But I guess it really started with when that dress I was telling you about when I was 19, I was like, this time I'm going to sew a dress and this time I'm not going to stop until it works. And literally when I decided when I was 22, 21, that I was going to build a house, like a whole house, granted a small one, but like still a whole freaking house on a trailer. I was like, oh, I'm sure I can do that because I made that dress once. And in my head, it was like, that is perfectly correlated. Sewing a dress is totally the same thing as building a house with no building experience whatsoever at all. But like, if you have that in your head and you're like, well, I can just do that. It's so much fun to see what you come up with. And if you can keep an open mind and know that like, you probably won't get it right the first time. Like there've been 3 harps. There's going to be another one. There've been 2 banjos, there've been infinity of underwear and, whatever else. But like, if you can get your mind in that space, like it's so exciting to see what you can come up with and what you can create.
Well, I love this for numerous reasons. It's like a very practical approach to creativity. And much like yourself, I hate shopping due to an ex-girlfriend. And I remember thinking next time it's going to be, if you want to shop for lingerie, I'll shop with you for that. But that's about it. Like, that's the only reason I would ever go shopping with you. Because I had an ex-girlfriend who would literally spend 4 hours looking at shoes. Like, no guy should know what a patent leather peep toe heel is. And I do.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry. That's hilarious.
Yeah. And I kind of have to wonder if, you were Indian in a past life between the fact that you're cheap and your mom was always late. Those are all very, Indian qualities.
That's awesome. I'll have to ask.
So one final question before we wrap things up, or 2 more. So there's a line in a book that Heather Havrilesky wrote. She had this book, a column called Dear Sugar on the Rumpus that later on was turned into a book. And she described creative people as misfits amongst misfits. And that always stayed with me. And so what I wonder is, as when you're this like bizarre creative person who has a sort of multi-hyphenate career that takes you in all these directions, how does that impact your relationships?
Oh,
I just opened up a rabbit hole that'll take another hour for us to talk about.
Don't worry. I can make long stories fast. But it's interesting because, that's such an interesting aspect of everything because relationships are definitely an interesting component of, being. The hard part is that like when you allow yourself for your creative sort of tendencies to just kind of be like the main takeover. Like at some point, that there's sort of and not that there's anything particularly wrong with it, but there's sort of like a selfishness to that. And I think for me, at least, that's been really healthy because a lot of my mindset is sort of like making sure that everybody's okay and making sure that, somebody else is happy and make sure I'm doing all the things. And a lot of my anxiety, is totally self-imposed, but gets sort of stuck on that loop of being like, okay, I need to make sure everything's fine. I need to make sure this thing's done or that thing's done for this person or something, or this person's going to get mad at me if I don't do that. And a lot of me sort of embracing my creativity and moving forward with it like that was that like, I just was kind of like, well, fuck that stuff. I'm just going to do me. And, yeah, I mean, I was in a relationship for 7 years, that was super awesome with my ex, who still films all my videos and takes all my photos and design, still builds my harps and stuff. So it's like, it was as amicable comes, but like, it pretty much wrecked my relationship. Like I wrecked my relationship, but more specifically, like my creativity and all the things that I had this drive to accomplish were sort of, the killers to it, because it's a pretty selfish endeavor in a lot of ways. It's also super hard to have friends unless they have like goals. Like it's really hard to have friends that don't have goals, because you're pretty much like that mega asshole person that's like, look what I made today. And it's like, dude, shut up. And like, if other people have goals and they're working towards things too, it's a little bit better. But like, for the most part, like I just have such a hard time like connecting with women in general, because they're just like, dude, I don't care. And I'm like, I know. And then, there's like a silent moment. And I'm like, guess what I'm going to do? Or like, I made this thing and I'm so happy. And it's like, whoa, like not, and I don't shop. So it's like, and not to totally like put women into some category where all they're going to talk about is like shopping or something. But it's like, there's enough things that are awkward about everything that I do that I'm like, I pretty much just, I have a lot of acquaintances, but I pretty much just pour everything into my creativity, because I know that I am happiest there, and everything else just kind of has to like fill in the gaps. And I hate saying that because it's like, you really should prioritize, relationships and stuff and all that kind of what have you. But like, for me, it's like, I actually can't make myself do something that my body won't let me do. Like that's kind of one of the things that's been really helpful for me in my development as a person, is that like, there'll just be these times when my body's like, yo, you actually have to do this now. And I'm like, no, I don't. And it's like, well, all right, well, I'm just going to make you super sick for a couple months and then you'll figure it out. It's like, it just really won't let me. And so like, that's what has gotten me, this far, I guess, though. And I think at a point I just have to realize that like, there's different people, there's different, people have different ways of living and different everything, and everyone's an individual. Right. And unfortunately, as much as I don't want to be the asshole that's just off doing my own thing and like, not caring about other stuff. And I hope that it's not that to an extreme, but at a certain point, it's like, dude, I really just have to try. And I'm just balancing my own mental health by doing this anyway. So it's like, I would literally just like implode if I weren't doing it. So, my boyfriend now is like, he kind of came in with this whole like, well, she's a wacko and she makes things all the time. And I might not see her for a few days if she's like locked up in this hole of like, whatever creative pursuit is sort of happening in that time frame. But I think it's just being really honest with people and just, it's kind of like a take it or leave it situation, because I have really tried to be normal and I just can't. So I don't really think there's any point in trying to do it. And I think a lot of it is like, for anybody out there, that's like feels this sort of same thing. It's like, I spend so much of my life like trying to fit in and like trying to be normal. And I'm so over that shit. Like, at this point, it's like, if I'm that different, then I'm probably just supposed to stand out. So I'm just not going to fight it anymore and just keep being weird. So, relationships are super important. And like feeling like you have that is those connections, and that you can, share ideas with people, that's obviously really critical. But at a certain extent, if you're weird enough, like sometimes the people around you aren't your target audience, they don't see what you see. And sometimes it's really, really hard to have people around you that you love, that, they're not the person you're trying to reach with what you're doing. So like, it's hard for people sometimes to be as supportive as you want them to be, because they don't see what you see in your head. So much of it is just kind of like continuing to like, it sounds so lame, but like continuing to like believe in yourself. It is literally the hardest thing I've ever consistently tried to work at in my life, is the actual like, the trite, like believe in yourself. But like, it's super hard, because a lot of times the people you have around you they can't believe in you the way that you want them to, because they can't see the vision that you have, and they aren't your target audience. They're your mother, or they're not my mother. She supports everything, but like, they aren't the person that you're trying to reach with something. So it's like, you really have to you have to be pretty self-reliant. You have to use your own resourcefulness to get you out of the ruts that sometimes are imposed by the people that you love the most.
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean, it's funny. And part of the reason I asked the question is because, look, like my parents have been on this like quest to try to set me up. And it's like, I don't fit the mold at all for any, Indian parent. Like my sister being a doctor, I was like, she's every Indian parent's dream come true. I'm every Indian parent's nightmare come true. And like my dad doesn't read my books. I don't think my dad has ever heard a single episode of this podcast, and it doesn't bother me anymore. Like I finally made my peace with that and realized I would never get that validation. But yeah, I mean, when I thought about relationships, that was why I asked the question, because, each time, I've had this conversation with my parents, I was like, what are you going to tell this girl's parents, that I'm some weirdo artist who like hosts a podcast and doesn't have a real job? Like, that's probably not going to go over too well.
That's so funny.
Well, I have one final question for you, which I know you have heard me ask. What do you think it is that makes somebody or something unmistakable?
What do I think it is that makes it unmistakable? You just have to, like I sort of said earlier, like it's you and your creativity for your entire life. All it is you. And honestly, there's other people, there's distractions, there's things that come and go. If you can find a way to take your creativity and make your brain happy and make you happy and get in that space where your creative brain can actually do the processing that it needs to do, like, I think that's like, at least for creative, to me, that's the most I can make out of life, is just give your brain the space to think about stuff, allow yourself to do it, keep believing in yourself, and just stick with it, basically. Because like there's no love to be gained from being stuck in somebody else's vision of how you're supposed to be. So, the time will pass anyway. You might as well spend it being as creative as fucking possible.
Wow. I can't think of a more fitting ending. This has to have been one of my favorite conversations I've had this year.
So glad to hear that. Thank you so much for having me on. I absolutely love to be able to talk through the wacky brainwaves of other crazy people.
My pleasure. I can't thank you enough for taking the time to join us. Where can people find out more about you, your work, and everything that you're up to?
Absolutely. ellaharp.com. Ella Harp, one word. You can find me on Instagram, Spotify, all those things for the music and stuff. But Instagram's kind of my main jam for posting things that I make and creativity, trying to get better at making YouTube videos, but it's so hard. But yeah, Ella Harp, super, super excited to have been here today. Thank you infinitely.
And for everybody listening, we will wrap the show with that.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Unmistakable Creative Podcast. While you were listening, were there any moments you found fascinating, inspiring, instructive, maybe even heartwarming? Can you think of anyone, a friend or a family member who would appreciate this moment? If so, take a second and share today's episode with that one person, because good ideas and messages are meant to be shared.
Acast powers the world's best podcasts. Here's a show that we recommend.
I'm Alan Crossley, and as a certified master hypnotist and NLP practitioner, I know a thing or two about helping people to relax. If you've ever had trouble falling asleep, we'd like to invite you to listen to the Tracks to Relax Guided Sleep Meditations podcast. Join the millions of people who've put an end to occasional insomnia and discovered just how easy it is to relax deeply and fall asleep fast at bedtime. Reduce stress and get the rest you deserve by listening to a soothing sleep meditation tonight. The Tracks to Relax Guided Sleep Meditations podcast really is the most relaxing way to end your day. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Acast recommends.